Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Alou, and I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our event featuring 4 experts from Stanford who've worked at ground zero of the tech revolution and for decades have been gathering information, and they're here today to share their views on how big tech might have gone wrong and how we can reboot. Our programs are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors, and today we need your support more than ever to sustain the museum on delivering in our core mission to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, the digital present, and the future impact on the human condition. And here today to introduce the program is Marguerite Gong-Hancock, the museum's VP of Innovation. Marguerite?
Thanks so much, Daniel. I'm really thrilled to add my warm welcome. And today we're continuing CHM's ongoing discussion about how to shape a better future, really our collective future as digital citizens. So what happens when a philosopher, a computer scientist, and a political scientist who also have deep experience in leading tech firms and government come together to probe how our lives, our politics, and even our values are being affected by technologies in ways that we were just beginning to understand? Well, together, Rob Reich, Meron Sahami, and Jeremy Weinstein created a highly popular course at Stanford University, and now a new book called System Error, where big tech went wrong and how we can reboot. From their ongoing work in this program today, they're going to explore major issues around the impact of the rise of decision-making by algorithms, the amount of user data collected by big tech companies, increasing automation and the proliferation of disinformation online. And they're going to also talk about potential answers from their point of view to important questions such as, how can we exercise our agency? How can we reinvigorate our democracy and direct the digital revolution in ways that will best serve our collective societal interest? To lead this conversation, we're really thrilled to welcome back another Stanford expert, Maricha Shaka. And as is tradition here at CHM, I am thrilled to introduce our speakers by 5 numbers. First, Rob Reich. He's professor of political science, director of the Center for Ethics and Society, and associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. 96,407 words in their new book, System Error. 10.24%, the probability with the last name starting with R to be listed first out of 3 on the book cover. 104, the current age of his grandmother who has lived through 2 pandemics. 4 C's of diamonds, cut, clarity, carat, and color, used for his first real job as a high schooler at a local jewelry store. And last but not least, 13, triskaidekaphilia, love of his lucky number. Welcome, Rob. Next, introducing Meron Sahami. He's professor in the School of Engineering and professor and associate chair for education in the computer science department at Stanford University, and also former full-time senior research scientist at Google. 5, the age when he immigrated to US from Iran. $100, the amount he received for his first programming job. 2.2 million views on YouTube of his first lecture of his computer programming methodology course. 2,000 volunteer code and place TAs who taught 22,500 students during the pandemic. And 8, the total number of COVID vaccine doses taken by 4 members of his household. So glad to have you here, Meron. Next, Jeremy Weinstein. He's professor of political science, director of Stanford Global Studies, and senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research at Stanford University. 1, the number of times posted on a social media platform. 1984, the year he moved to Palo Alto, California. More than 250 additional students that he teaches when he's teaching about the computer science and political science departments. 44th President Barack Obama, for whom he served on the National Security Council and as chief of staff, then deputy to the US ambassador to the United Nations. 51, number of wins by the San Francisco Giants halfway through the 2021 season. Go Giants. Welcome, Jeremy. And last but not least, who better to lead this conversation than Maricha Shaka? She's the International Policy Director at the Cyber Policy Center and International Policy Fellow at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence in Stanford. 10 years as a representative in the European Parliament, 2 years at Stanford, including 1.5 remotely. First book she's writing, 24,300 people following on Twitter, and O20, the old phone code for Amsterdam, still used to refer to the city. So glad to have all 4 of you here today. We're looking forward to your conversation. Over to you, Maricha.
Thank you so much. And from my side, also a warm welcome to everybody joining. It's a real celebration today as well. I want to congratulate Meron, Jeremy, and Rob on the official launch of their book system Reboot, where big tech went wrong and how we can reboot it. And I can't stress enough how important it is to hear such a diagnosis, well-researched, well-argued from Americans. I say that being in Europe now, but of course the world is looking at what the United States is doing, both in terms of strengths coming out of Silicon Valley, but also the harms and the ripple effects that that has around the world. It's important to hear this from professors at the very university that has birthed so many big tech ideas, leaders, business models, technologies, and disruptions, Stanford. And I've had the pleasure of seeing and hearing bits of the analysis that you can now all read, and I've seen it evolving over the past 1.5 years or so. So I'm going to be comfortable calling you by your first names. We're colleagues, even if the travel ban forces me to be at a distance. But when we were all at Stanford, I had the pleasure of guest lecturing in that very popular class that was just mentioned and that you taught also together on ethics, public policy, and technological change. And as some of you may know, the public in policy is especially close to my heart and high on my priority list. So I hope we can learn more today in this conversation about how private governance may impede public values and democracy as such, and of course, how we can repair a broken machinery. So to start us off, I would like to invite each of you to briefly share what you see as the main system error. And I would like to start with Jeremy, then hear from Rob, and close this question with Meron. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Maricha, and thanks to the Computer History Museum for hosting us for this book launch event. For me, the main system error is that technology as it's currently being designed encodes a set of values. And those values are often in tension with other values that we might care about. And the challenge is that as technology is being designed, the people making choices about what values to optimize for are the technologists who design technology and the companies that provide the environment in which technology is being created. But where's everyone else in this conversation? And so the system failure is that when there are tensions between values, the tension between what we get from the aggregation of data that makes possible all sorts of incredible services and tools, but it comes at a cost of privacy, or what we get when algorithms are used to introduce extraordinary efficiency into decision-making processes, but raise questions about fairness and bias and due process. When we have these kinds of trade-offs, where is the collective? And the system error is that our politics is not playing a central role in refereeing these value trade-offs, that we've left these decisions to a small number of individuals who work in tech companies or who run tech companies to make decisions that have massive implications for all of us. Not only the individual benefits that we realize in a technology, but also social effects and increasingly social harms that we can no longer avoid.
All right, well, let me hop in there if I'm second in the queue. I'll put it in a way where I don't have a policy background, I don't have the technical background. My initial exposure to all of this was as an ordinary user of the tools and technologies that came out of Stanford and Silicon Valley. And from my point of view, the phrase you used, Maricha, is the one that's so important to me: private governance. The big tech company is located here in the Valley, partially perhaps in Seattle. have acquired, something akin to a grab over our lives as individuals and our lives as citizens in a democratic society. And the programming Davids, the countercultural attitude of the early age of Silicon Valley, well, those programming Davids have now become the Goliaths. And the pandemic has actually reinforced this whole lesson for me, at least, which is we were already aware of some of the problems of big tech 18 months ago, but now our lives have become even more enmeshed in the decisions made by a very small number of people inside a very small number of tech companies. We're dependent in ways that we weren't even 18 months ago dependent upon a small number of platforms for our work lives, for our private lives, for our educational lives. And the power that's vested now in just a tiny number of people in Silicon Valley amounts to private governance. And that's not serving us as citizens very well at all.
So what I'd add is taking the technologist point of view is thinking about the system error from the standpoint of how we actually think about the systems that get built. And I think oftentimes in technology, systems get built with particular metrics in mind that are easily quantifiable and the notion that we want to scale. And part of the issues there is if we have metrics that are just easily quantifiable, that doesn't necessarily mean they match the things we really want. They're proxies for the things we really want. And when you get to scale, what sometimes happens is that what you're actually measuring and the thing you actually want begin to diverge more and more. You may want to have people say, take pleasure from using something, but the way you measure that is time on platform. And that's not really whether or not they're getting a benefit from it. It's just the thing that's easy to measure. And so when you take that at scale, there's a greater divergence between the things we want and the things that are actually the outcomes. And from the standpoint of people who build systems, when we think about what do we test, what do we measure, it's not just about our systems working, it's not just about simple metrics, but it's actually understanding from a broader picture. We need to understand more about the societal impacts that we have when we build, for example, machine learning models, the actual impact they have on people rather than just an error rate that we can measure in the lab. And those are the kinds of things we need to bring into the discussion as this technology gets built out and deployed further.
Thank you. I think it paints a great picture of the angles that you each take and what makes the combination of those views so special about the book. Early on in the book, you portray a student who has developed a very disruptive startup, but you really see his attitude as representing a trend in Silicon Valley. So I'm going to quote a small piece. He just lives in a world where it is normal not to think twice about how new technology companies could create harmful effects. So I want to ask maybe a little bit more of a critical question, and that is, to what extent has Stanford University, where each of you have a long history and a lot of experience in working with students, to what extent has Stanford actively and also successfully created the very culture where disruption is admired? Giving access to the companies in Silicon Valley for students, but also inviting CEOs and other tech executives in to teach. So I would love to hear a bit of a reflection from each of you on how Stanford plays a role in that typical disruptive ecosystem, starting with Rob, then going to Meron, and concluding for this question with Jeremy.
Stanford absolutely bears a significant responsibility for some of the problems we see in big tech and for that very kind of cultural orientation to aspire toward disruption, to look for ways to code in your pajamas and roll your product out quickly and see what happens, throw spaghetti on the wall and figure out any problems downstream. We've seen that personally, or I have at least, in teaching generations of different Stanford students, because in the past 5 years, the kind of professionalization that even young students come to at Stanford with, an eye toward engaging with the venture capitalists who also populate campus and finding ways to leverage their ideas into a startup. I once had in my office hours a first quarter 18-year-old kid who had taken a political philosophy class with me, came to office hours to chat about that. And I was making small talk with him. What are you thinking of majoring in? He said, I'm definitely going to be a computer science major. And I said, great, that's really interesting. And he said, I actually have some startup ideas already. Making small talk, continued on, said, that's interesting. Like, what's your idea? And he said, well, looked at me earnestly in the eye and said, to tell you, I'd have to ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And that kind of attitude just reflects the celebration that Stanford has had for a long time of the disruptive ethos. And I'll wrap this up just by saying, from my point of view, it gives Stanford a special responsibility to respond to some of the very things that it has participated in creating. And I mean that not only as the set of products that might have been developed at Stanford and then brought to scale in Silicon Valley as companies, but this cultural orientation that also is very present here at Stanford. And rather than just a pantheon of heroes, typically white guys who are the founders of companies and whose names everyone knows when they're at Stanford, we need an alternative pantheon. And the passage you quoted from the beginning of the book about this disruptive founder is matched with a short profile of another person who imagined himself as a civic technologist by the name of Aaron Swartz. We need more Aaron Swartzes, more Audrey Tangs, more, if you will, Maricha Shakas of the world to be aspirational figures for the young students at Stanford and for technologists writ large.
So to take a little bit of historical perspective on it, I'm sure there's people in this audience who would remember that 20 years ago, it was actually, there was a drop in the number of computer science majors. There was actually a worry as to whether or not computer science would, continue to grow as a field because there was such a precipitous decline in the number of students going into it. And so both at Stanford and nationally, there were efforts to try to increase the number of people going into technology. And, I'm happy to say those efforts actually wildly succeeded. And the number of computer science majors at Stanford has grown by about 350% in the last 15 years. It's the largest major on campus, both for men and for women. About 1 in 5 students at Stanford majors in computer science now. And part of that transformation was talking about the world-changing ability of technology, how you could make an impact on big problems through the use of computing. And I think that's still true. But I think what we've also woken up to in the last 5-6 years more clearly is what are the real social impacts of these technologies at scale? What does it mean for other values we care about? So things like privacy and personal autonomy. And as those things come into play, because Stanford is an educational institution, it behooves us to integrate that more into the educational process for our students so we can balance both the power of computing, because it's still a very powerful platform, with the social responsibility that comes with the things that we do when we build out these large platforms. And so I think that's really the place where Stanford clearly has a responsibility on both sides, on both the developing technologists who've gone out to build some of these things that now we're seeing some of the consequences of, but at the same time understanding that and charting a better path forward so we can actually teach both the next generation of technologists and some of the work we do with people who are already out in industry to think about more about the social consequences and how we can mitigate the negative effects.
In some sense, Stanford is a microcosm of what has been happening more broadly in technology, right? It played a critical role in birthing the ecosystem, that is Silicon Valley. It also rode this period of tremendous tech optimism to just extraordinary heights as an institution. And we saw that reflected in every aspect of the campus. But in riding that wave of tech optimism and then confronting a moment of tech backlash, we now face exactly that dynamic playing out on campus. A lack of trust in the major tech companies, a concern among individual CS majors about whether they want to be associated with these societal harms. And so it puts us in a position as educators on campus where we have to think and dig deep with our students around the questions of how do we amplify the benefits of technology while also mitigating these evident harms. And so the book itself calls for this kind of nuanced, adult, pragmatic conversation that's not tech optimism and that's not tech pessimism, but that recognizes that technology itself isn't value neutral. It involves a set of trade-offs. It generates benefits alongside costs. And our challenge collectively is to think about how to weigh those things. The last thing I'd just say on this point, Maricha, is that while we can focus on Stanford and think about its potential role, or in talking about the tech companies, we can focus on their corporate leaders and their CEOs. The big picture argument of the book is that individualizing these kinds of challenges misses the bigger challenge that we face, which is that the system error that we're describing is a function of an optimization mindset that is embedded in computer science and that's embedded in technology that basically ignores the competing values that need to be refereed as new projects are designed. It's also embedded in the structure of the venture capital industry that's driving the growth of Silicon Valley and the growth of these companies that prioritizes scale before we even understand anything about the impacts of technology in society. And of course, it reflects the path that's been paved for these tech companies to market dominance by a government that's largely been in retreat from exercising any oversight. So yes, Stanford has an important role to play, and yes, there are individuals who maybe looked aside and didn't pay attention to these potential consequences at a moment of tremendous tech optimism. But the bottom line for us is that there are systemic challenges that need to be addressed, and Stanford needs to be at the center of addressing those systemic challenges, but Stanford can't do it alone.
Thanks. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I recognize, even if I've only been at Stanford for about 2 years, that sort of change in the types of questions that people are asking, the awareness also after January 6th, the storming of the US Capitol, after disinformation around COVID-19, that people really thought, you know, the problems are not just elsewhere in the world or in other communities, but they can also truly hit home, and the harms are real. They're not virtual, so to say. But we also see how hard it is for students to find jobs outside of the big tech companies that offer great salaries when people have real student loans to deal with. So maybe we can touch upon that a little bit later. For now, I wanted to focus on that big question of governance, because I see governance as one of the main themes of the book. On the one hand, you have many anecdotes and stories about how the tech companies evolved, how technology itself sets standards, how injecting venture capital dollars steers companies in a different direction. But you also are quite critical about the abdication of responsibility on the part of political and democratic leaders. And you write, and I quote, "The abstract virtues of democracy are difficult to mesh with a few harsh realities that appear again and again when it comes to governing technology. The technical ignorance of elected politicians who are hardly credible in providing oversight or contemplating regulation. Profound disagreements about what we value and how trade-offs should be made." But on the other hand, your book is truly a call to action, and I think also one that has laws that should be updated, regulations that should be adopted as a path for change. So I think you hope to reach lawmakers in DC and perhaps even overseas so that they will jump to action. So my question is, what do you think we can expect from those democratically elected officials in the United States? And how can there be a rebalancing? Is it feasible to have a rebalancing of tech knowledge among politicians, but also democracy knowledge among engineers? And I would just like to ask each of you to focus on sort of one priority, one thing you would change if you had a magic wand when it comes to policy. And I would like to start with Meron, then Rob, and then close with Jeremy for this question.
It's a great question, Maricha. I think if I had a magic wand, the thing I would focus on is moving the locus of thinking of agency from just it's all about individual choice to thinking about what is collectively possible. And what I mean by that is oftentimes the question around engaging with technology and what choice people have is made at the individual level, right? It's you have the opportunity to use a particular app or not use an app or delete an existing app. You might be able to say, set your privacy settings on a particular application or in your web browser as to what kind of cookies you want to get or what kind of information you're giving putting out. But that places all of the onus on the individual to have to try to protect things that they care about. And I think the bigger question here is, can we actually have a system that helps the individual? And the analogy I always like to draw is the roadway system, right? We don't just put people in cars and say, drive safely. And if you were worried about driving safely, then don't drive, right? That would be a ridiculous choice because there's real value in driving. So what do? We create a whole set of infrastructure where we say there's things like lanes, there's traffic lights, there's speed bumps. That's all comes about through regulation to say we're going to create a system that has guardrails for safety. Now, within that, you can still choose to drive or not. You can still think about how you drive safely, but we have a system that makes driving safer for everyone. And so I think that's the place I would want to get to, is going from the conversation of this is just about individual choice to thinking about how we have a larger system that provides those guardrails.
All right, well, I'm tempted to say something very specific about, what's on the possible horizon in DC or elsewhere with respect, say, to algorithmic auditing or federal privacy legislation or antitrust action against the big companies. But I'm going to stick to my philosophical roots, as it were, and wave my magic wand, as you invited me to do, to try to point at this optimization mindset of the technologist, which, when that optimization mindset becomes an outlook about life as a whole, when, as one of our colleagues at Stanford sometimes tells students, everything in life is an optimization problem, then you look to democratic institutions as failing to optimize the things we care about. And you complain about the inefficiencies and the drag and the lack of intelligence, perhaps, of elected leaders and our democratic institutions. Democracy is not an institutional design that's meant in the first place, in my view, to optimize. It's meant as a way of refereeing the messy and conflicting preferences of citizens in a way that's constantly adaptable to new challenges and a new day. And so what I would try to use my magic wand to do is to keep the optimization mindset in its place, as it were, in it as a technical orientation, but not as an outlook on life. Because what's ultimately at stake is whether or not the big tech companies and the technologists who work there care about the integrity of our democracy and maintaining the health of democratic institutions here and abroad.
So as the former policymaker of this triumvirate, who has no shortage of scars and cuts and bruises from my own time in Washington, it's hard not to look at what's happening in Washington and see tremendous paralysis. And it's hard not to look at the polarization in the United States and feel like absolutely nothing is possible. But one of the places that we start in the book is by trying to focus people's attention on the alternative to re-energizing our democracy. The alternative to re-energizing our democracy is leaving the set of decisions about how technology unfolds and how it impacts society, leaving those decisions to the technologists and to the companies building these technologies. And I think we have a pretty good preview from the last decade and a half or 2 decades of what the consequences are of leaving the decisions, in this case, to the experts or technocrats. And so when you hear from corporate leaders or investors in Silicon Valley an anti-regulation push, a view that regulation is just going to slow down innovation, regulation is going to get in the way of sort of the progress that we need in our economy, we want you to understand that anti-regulation push as essentially a rejection of democracy. It's a rejection of the role of our political institutions, which are the technology that we've selected as a society to help us referee the critical value trade-offs that exist. Now, you're right to say, and you read a quote to this effect, that our democracy isn't up to the task. And it's not up to the task, not only because of the lack of technical knowledge that you pointed to, but because of a set of institutional features that have made progress very difficult to achieve. And so everyone's reasonable expectation about what legislation is likely to come out of Congress is none, right? That's the best prediction that you could make in this system at the current moment. Now, Washington is all aflutter with debates about the future of antitrust, questions about content moderation and the Communications Decency Act. But one of the places that we start, and this was excerpted in a piece in The Atlantic that was published a couple days ago is, can we find a set of areas for legislative action where democracy can do what it's best at, which is achieve consensus on the most evident harms that need to be avoided in the near term? Because there's agreement among both parties and among the constituencies that support both parties of the changes that are required. And we identify 3 areas that we think are those areas of agreement currently. One is around data privacy and the huge asymmetry of power that exists between companies that access our personal data and individuals that have to navigate an outdated regulatory model of notice and consent. The second is about the use of algorithms in high stakes decision-making settings, whether it's credit or access to medical services or in our criminal justice system. The lack of transparency, due process, fairness, kinds of considerations that are being brought to the rollout of these systems is something that all of us should be concerned about as it displaces human judgment in our lives. And then the third is the effects of AI and the growth of AI on the workforce. While in the near term, it makes sense to think that the effects are going to be mostly felt among lower wage workers. And so we need to think about our social safety net and its evolution with respect to job displacement. In reality, over the medium term, this transition to an AI-powered economy is going to affect everyone's job. We say this to the computer programmers in our class, that AI tools are going to be remaking their jobs in the future. And we need an orientation from the federal government and the states that really recognizes, how do we prepare people for this workforce of the future? That's not to say that we don't think antitrust is absolutely central or content moderation are central, and we go in depth on those issues in the book. But if you're asking me what's achievable in our current political moment, I think we need to avoid the tendency to boil the ocean and try and solve every problem with a sweeping piece of legislation on the future of tech, and to pick out those areas immediately to show that progress is possible, to show that democracy can flex its muscles.
Thank you. As someone with the couple of scars from having served in public office, I mean, it's sometimes tempting to sort of defend, right, elected officials when this criticism comes, even if I completely recognize the paralysis in DC, and sometimes wonder, is that because the regulation of certain tech applications came too late, and has it exacerbated the divisions and the entrenchment that we currently see, certainly in the United States? But I do think that what you shared about, the sort of momentum that is building is also more universally true. Policy usually responds to changing realities. And when you look around any representation, whether it's a city council or the US Congress or the European Parliament for that matter, I think there's few experts. And with tech, it is often pointed to as a problem. Whereas with other topics, I mean, if you ask a set of farmers how up to date the knowledge is on agriculture, I'm sure they'll not be too impressed. So we also, I think, have to find ways to work with the generalists, or the variety of expertise, so to say, that often exists in representations in a democracy, rather than expecting that all Stanford grads will run for office anytime soon. Although it would be a nice solution, I think, to some of the problems. Anyway, sorry for the distraction. I wanted to go from asking you all to respond to my questions to asking each of you a specific question. And then we've had quite a few from the audience pouring in. So I think we can start with those. And for all of you who are pondering on your question, feel free to drop them in the Q&A function. I'm collecting them as we go. So the first question also kind of builds on what you just said, Jeremy, is for you, because you have seen from your past job as representing the US administration, the Obama administration at the United Nations, how technology and big tech are also disrupting more fragile societies, not just American democracy, but also emerging economies and the world's most vulnerable. Can you speak to where you would like to see American leadership on the global scale when it comes to dealing with these tech topics? Or can you speak to why it matters globally what happens in the United States?
Thanks so much for the question. And Maricha, of course, I appreciate your point on expertise. We don't elect people as experts, we elect them as representatives, and their job is to navigate a complex array of issues and to represent the constituencies that have sent them into office. But we need to think about how we design our political institutions to ensure that the expertise that's available to them isn't only coming from paid lobbyists that represent a particular point of view. And I think that's where we're falling short in our democratic institutions, that with a set of elected representatives and sort of senior executives in government, without an ability to generate technical expertise that speaks to issues of the public interest rather than the corporate interest, they're dependent on the technical expertise that comes from high-paid lobbyists. And that's not unique to the United States, but maybe it's exacerbated in the United States, and something that we absolutely need to address. I really appreciate the question that challenges us to put this issue in a global perspective. And maybe the first and most important thing to say is that the harms that technology is causing, whether intended or unintended, are not just felt by citizens in the United States. They're felt by people all around the world, because the US happens to have given birth to powerful tech companies whose choices are shaping the lives of billions of people around the world. And so the absence of leadership from our democratic institutions in thinking about how to amplify benefits and mitigate harms has implications not just for American citizens. We talk about disinformation and misinformation with respect to the American election, but of course this is played out in spades in other electoral contexts. We think about the use of encrypted communication to mobilize violence that's committed against citizens by vigilante groups. The promotion of hate speech and incitement on social media platforms in other countries in the world. And of course, the impacts of AI on jobs and the future of work isn't a uniquely American challenge either. And maybe as someone who served at the United Nations, I can say one of the reasons that the United Nations exists is that there was a view after World War II that we needed to create a forum in the world where everyone could be heard, where everyone had a voice. And maybe the gap between the reality of the current moment and a future that some of us might want to envision is the fact that most people have no say whatsoever in the way that technology is impacting their lives. So if you are impacted by technology and you're living in South Asia or in Africa or in Latin America, these are places where, because the tech companies are not headquartered there, because governments feel at the mercy of the providers of these products to pave the way for these companies to operate, you as a citizen and even your elected officials don't even have a voice. Now, I'm not suggesting that some global governance regime is going to make sense for technology. Ultimately, I think the responsibility for governing technology in this case begins with the absent actor at the table, which is the United States, which is where these companies are headquartered. But one of the most important steps that needs to happen is that instead of really seeing this primarily through the lens of competition with China, which is a frame that you see often brought to the table, which is just another recipe for let the tech companies do what they want, because otherwise we will lose in the race for innovation with China. I think we need to recognize that the harms are real, and that ultimately we have a set of democratic governments that share values, that care about things like justice and fairness and well-being, that care about privacy and autonomy. And these governments need to be working together rather than working in opposition to one another. And ultimately, that's the challenge that the Biden administration confronts. But we shouldn't pretend that it's a simple problem to solve, because in fact, the distance between the European Union and the United States on tech regulation right now may be as wide as the distance with non-democratic regimes around the world. That is, we haven't forged a consensus around what the problem is and how to regulate. But we need to move toward a much more open and transparent conversation about the values that are at stake in tech. And we need to recognize that the choices that need to be made legislatively and by the executive branch in the United States are choices that need to be coordinated with others and that need to create space to understand harms that are not only felt by Americans, but are felt by people all around the world.
Absolutely. Well said. Meron, I want to go to you with this popular phrase that I hear more and more. It's human-centered when we talk about technology. And I see it often as being a kind of reassurance about how AI and other technologies can actually be kept in check. I mean, humans should have the last word, or should have a say, or should have oversight. What are your thoughts about, you know, human-centered AI and the role of people in these increasingly automated processes? And how do we avoid that it is not just a sort of PR or, you know, catchy slogan that loses meaning?
Yeah, I think that's a real worry, because sometimes you can just slap a label on something and believe that that makes the problem better when it doesn't do anything. I think one of the important things to keep in mind for human-centered AI, sometimes it gets interpreted as like, oh, we have a human in the loop for AI decision making. And I think really what's more fundamental for human-centered AI is thinking about a participatory process in which we think about people participating in what is the AI they would like to see built, and understanding what's its actual impact and the downstream problems that it may generate and need to be mitigated. So, you know, it gets back to that question of, well, who controls the technology, right? Is it in the hands of a few people, or is there actually an opportunity to get broader participation in thinking about what tech gets designed? I think that's the real key to human-centered AI, right? Is thinking about, in machine learning models, for example, an error rate is just not an error rate. It is about human lives being infected. And so when you make a mistake about whether or not someone remains in jail in the criminal justice system, that's not, you know, 0.01% extra error rate. That's someone's life you've disrupted. And so unless there's a real understanding of that, then we're not being human-centered. We're being, you know, in some sense, algorithmically centered, because we're thinking about what can the algorithms do, what can the technology do, as opposed to what the real impacts on people are. I think there's a good example of this, because I think, you know, one of the things that when, you know, we tried to take this balanced approach in the book is it's not just, you know, big tech bad or big tech good. It's about, you know, even in the same company, you see places where the technology is being thought of in a human-centered way and places where it's not. And so I'll give you, you know, one example that we bring up in the book. You know, Amazon.com had built a system to screen resumes, right, for hiring, because hiring these days, especially at large companies, is such a high volume process. So by building a model, could they, of people they'd hired before and not hired, could they screen resumes that if this person had a high likelihood, according to the model, of being hired, that they should probably get an interview? And what they found in building the system is the model had gender bias in it. So it actually downranked resumes that included the word women, or that had the names of all women's colleges on there. And so, you know, this is one of the most technologically sophisticated companies on the planet. They looked at this and they tried to mitigate, you know, the gender bias in the model. And ultimately they concluded that they couldn't do it. So they scrapped the model. Right? That's an example of human-centered AI, right? They understand what the impacts are. They actually test this out before they deploy it at scale and have a bunch of gender biased decisions actually being made, and ultimately decide that if you can't fix it, you shouldn't deploy it, right? Because those error rates are real. They're affecting real people's lives. So I think there are, you know, examples of this. These are the kinds of things that we want to hold up as how the tech sector itself can work on these issues. But we need to be broader than that when we get back to the point of thinking about, we shouldn't just rely on someone doing this. If we think about the fact that there's actually some guidelines around how models should be evaluated, what kinds of things should be measured, what do we need to have guarantees on before we deploy something at scale, then it not only provides a mechanism for policymakers or collective decision-making to impact what's happening in technology, it provides a way to actually help also educate technologists about what's important about human-centered technology. And if in the next startups coming along to build a piece of technology, it would be great for them to know, here are the kinds of things you need to watch out for. Here are some examples of where things have gone wrong in the past and how people have actually mitigated it. So I think the learning is actually a bidirectional process.
Thank you. When I hear you about, you know, including people in being represented to think about how the technology might work in their communities or in society, or questions around testing the impact first, I wonder whether you foresee a sort of onboarding or bringing in-house some of those otherwise, more democratic processes. So this whole idea of representation and including the voices in decision-making / policy-making, or the trend that we see with, Facebook developing an oversight board in a sort of process that mimics checks and balances, but is still under the roof of a company. And just curious how you see that. Do you foresee tech companies trying to inboard some of these governance functions more formally, or would you say we need to also create a wall or a distance between what companies decide and what type of oversight is applied, for example?
Well, I think both things need to happen, right? There needs to be more emphasis in the companies in terms of that human-centric design. And by that, I don't just mean, sort of, I get some, do some field work to see how I build the minimal viable product of what features people use and what features they don't, but actually trying to understand how are people harmed by this technology? Where are the benefits and what are the trade-offs? Where are the populations that are being served and who's not being served by that technology? Because one of the things that also happens is, in terms of the imprint of who's in the tech sector, that affects who's building the products and for whom they are building the products, right? And so there's some people that just get excluded from that whole effort. If we take a broader look at how we bring more people into the field, whether or not they're technologists or whether or not they're interfacing with technologists to talk about what the real harms are, that's a place where we can take better action or that we can get better technological outcomes. I don't see a separation with government in the sense that, government is over here kind of affecting policy. I do think that there has to be a give and take between the political sector and the technological sector to come up with solutions that work for everyone. Sometimes what we hear, though, in the technology sector is, it's about self-regulation, right? We know what we're doing. We're going to innovate. Regulation's going to get in the way. Let us do what we want to, what we can do, because we'll come up with good answers. And I think that's an interesting viewpoint, but the rejoinder I would make to that is that's great if you come up with a set of policies that you think are reasonable for self-regulation. Why wouldn't you want that codified as actual regulation? Why wouldn't you want additional people actually looking at that process and saying, this is something that makes sense to level the playing field across the entire industry? So if executives at companies change and they have different ideas about what they want to do, or new entrants come into the field, we have similar rules for everyone. So I think the notion of, self-regulation versus government regulation as being independent is kind of a red herring. I think the two can actually work together, but it's understanding that you need that collective input into the process to get the outcomes that actually work for everyone.
Maricha, let me add one thing if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
We began this effort about 4 years ago, engaging undergraduates at Stanford, because we saw future technologists as needing to engage these issues in the way that we're talking about today, at the intersection of the technology and how it's designed and the normative values that are at stake and ultimately how it affects society. But we saw this sort of unmet demand among professionals in the sector to also be having these conversations. And so we began to teach in the evenings, creating space for people in tech companies to be having these kinds of conversations. And it was striking to us the extent to which they weren't having those conversations and felt deeply disempowered vis-a-vis, their own companies that they were a part of. In fact, we'd often hear, what happens when you're thinking about sort of, selling a product to a new market and you're concerned about unintended consequences, or when you have to make a decision around, who should benefit and who should be harmed in the design of a particular algorithm, and you need to apply some fairness criterion. Who do you call? Who makes those decisions? And the answer is we call the Office of the General Counsel, because ethics is a compliance function in most companies right now. It's what is allowed by the law. And once we know what's allowed by the law, we understand our freedom to run and our freedom to move. I think that's no longer acceptable. We can't have ethics as a compliance function, because we know the limits of what our political system is going to be able to provide in terms of guardrails and guidance. And I think, key to the book is an argument that alongside the change that needs to happen in Washington is change that needs to happen in the field of computer science in terms of cultivating an ethic of responsibility and in the structure of business. And I think we're already seeing a preview in the structure of business about what this pressure looks like from workers, the talent that companies need to attract, who are saying it's not okay if you sell this product to anybody. I'm not going to want to dedicate my time and energy, or I'm concerned about the way in which this algorithm harms some populations and not others, or I am deeply concerned about the impacts on the health of our democracy of the choices that we're making with respect to political ads or content moderation. And so that push and pull, that give and take is the moment we're at. And there's a role for everyone in that conversation. And no one should walk away from our discussion today thinking that we're of the view that somehow regulation is going to come in and solve these problems. Ultimately, the big argument of the book is that there's agency for everyone. There's agency for you, if you're a technologist, to ask questions and to challenge your colleagues around potential harms. There's agency for you if you lead a company to think about what's your bottom line? What are the metrics that you're optimizing for? And of course, there's agency for citizens and politicians as well.
Thank you. It's a great addition and also a great preview for the question I wanted to ask Rob, who, of course, is an expert in ethics. And we do often hear, as you also referenced, Jeremy, the notion of ethics, being a solution, appointing an ethics officer or an ethics council, adopting AI ethics principles, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to ask Rob what you see as the merits, but also the pitfalls of how ethics is being invoked and used currently as part of the whole discussion around problems that big tech presents to us.
Great. Well, I want to first say two things that ethics aren't, or at least shouldn't be, and then one or two things about how in the book and in the classes that we teach, we try to frame a set of questions about ethics. So first of all, just as Jeremy said, we don't want ethics to be, you ask the general counsel, and ethics is just a compliance function. In the similar spirit, you don't want a company to appoint a chief ethics officer, as if you could just still abstain from any personal responsibility of your own in the company, as long as you run it up the chain to the ethics officer and that person can decide for everybody. We need a collective ethical orientation, as Jeremy said, or if you wish, like push ethics all the way down the design system of a company's product development line, and ensure that everyone has the permission to raise ethical questions and has a framework for thinking about the kinds of concerns that can come up. Okay. Also, what ethics is not, or at least it's not very interesting to think that ethics amounts to having a personal moral compass, or this all comes down to whether or not we have virtuous people who acquire power, and then we can allow their goodness as human beings to shine through and we'll be okay. Personal ethics is, in my view, of course, essential, but not very interesting. Elizabeth Holmes is going on trial this week here in San Jose. And she's, of course, the dropout founder of Theranos, the company exposed by the media to have allegedly a fraud at its heart, a technology that was supposed to be able to test blood in a simple way, but that never worked. If the lesson of Theranos teaches us anything, it's that the idea that you shouldn't lie, cheat, or steal when you're in a position of power, we know it happens, but ethically uninteresting. Like, there's no argument on behalf of lying, cheating, or stealing, and you probably learned that when you were a 5-year-old in kindergarten, or you should have. You don't need an ethics class at a university to tell you not to lie, cheat, or steal. All right, so don't focus on personal ethics either. Just as democracy is designed as a system that doesn't assume people are saints, so too should we think of a tech ecosystem that shouldn't have to depend on people being virtuous people all the time. All right, so what then do we need? It goes back to this idea of professional ethics and a set of frameworks for thinking about social and political ethics, those ideas of value trade-offs. And I'll end here just by focusing, since we talked a lot about the political ethics, or the ideas of values that are refereed by our political systems, say one thing about professional ethics. We look to in the book how it is that professional ethics have evolved in other fields, in particular in biomedical fields, healthcare provision, or pharmaceutical research. And partly in response to a bunch of scandals, whether it's World War II and Nazi era experiments on Jews in the concentration camps, or in the United States, the Tuskegee experiments that exposed a bunch of medical experimentation on Blacks with respect to syphilis. We have now developed a deep institutional footprint for medical ethics that goes from classes that you would encounter as a student in medical school, to ethics committees in hospitals, to what's called an institutional review board. If you ever want to do experimentation on human subjects, you have to do an ethics pass-through about it, to federal agencies that are tasked with overseeing the development and release of new drugs on the market. There's no equivalent of that type of professional ethics footprint within computer science or AI. We're in a kind of early phase of the maturation of the professional ethics of the field. And in the book, we point the way forward on a number of different fronts about how to accelerate that, so that computer scientists can begin to develop a much stronger professional ethic that has an institutional footprint as widely developed as it is in biomedicine.
Thank you. I was just looking at the last question that came in, which I'm going to ask first now to Rob, because it builds so well on what you just said. And then we're going to increase the pace because there's a ton of questions and I want to make sure we get
let's get the questions in.
Yes. So this one is for you, Rob. Does it make sense that all computer science degree programs include a mandatory ethics course? Short.
That sounds lovely, but that's actually not enough. Ethics is not a tick box. Oh, I got my ethics injection as a course and now I'm good to go. It has to be something that's embedded within the entire curriculum rather than a single class.
Thanks. First question came in pretty much before anyone said a word, which is, should big tech companies be broken up? Meron.
So I don't think just breaking up big tech companies is actually the solution. And if you think about, what are some of the problems that you want to try to solve with breaking up a big tech company? So let me give you a simple example. If we were to break up Facebook, would it suddenly lessen the amount of misinformation on the platform? Probably not. It would probably exacerbate it, because now you'd have a bunch of smaller companies that were trying to all deal with the same problem. And the solution is not we're going to allow some platforms to try to have more misinformation and some to have less misinformation. What we really want to have is an ecosystem with a lot less misinformation overall. Now, at the same time, there is a question around competition. And so I think one of the places that antitrust plays a role is just in terms of greater scrutiny, right? So when Facebook wants to acquire an Instagram or a WhatsApp, there would be greater scrutiny to see, is this actually anti-competitive? Is there a way that we could think about limiting the concentration of power in particular companies so that there are more consumer choices? Now, but thinking about that consumer choice is kind of the classic framework for antitrust doesn't work. It's about consumer pricing, and all these products are free. So we need to take a different frame, which is really thinking about what are the harms that we see happening. And those harms may not be about pricing. They may be about things like what happens to the information ecosystem, what happens in terms of concentration of power in a company. I think, Daniel would probably know this much better than I would, but I think, the thing that came out of the antitrust trial with Microsoft, even though Microsoft wasn't broken up, was just that I think over time they were more cautious around future acquisitions that they had, or what it meant in terms of concentration of power, in terms of competing with other companies, because they had seen the antitrust action taken before, even though it didn't result in a substantive breaking up of the company. So I think if we just show that there is at least that greater scrutiny, we'll get greater competition and less of the concentration of power. We might also see companies taking steps, although this one's a little bit more debatable, as to whether or not the products they produce are better in line with what consumers actually want.
Thank you. I also saw a question which builds nicely on yours, which is reminding us that Microsoft is still one of the biggest companies in the world. And the question whether the antitrust suit against Microsoft had any significant effect on its market power, and if not, what went wrong? Do you want to add thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the thought I would add is, if you look at the time frame from when the antitrust action happened against Microsoft to kind of the current day, one could argue, and people have made different arguments around this, and I actually believe they're true. You could get the emergence of other companies, right? Why could Google become such a powerhouse? Why did Apple really take off, right? Is because there was probably, I would imagine, a lot more scrutiny in Microsoft internally in terms of the competition in the marketplace and what kind of stance they took in terms of being more aggressive toward competitors. So I think that's what we actually saw, is that there was kind of a blunting of the aggressiveness in the marketplace, regardless of whether or not the company was actually broken up. So I don't think that was the key. It was just a change in attitude that happened as a result.
Thank you. This one is for Jeremy. Why are both Republican and Democratic administrations unwilling to stop big tech from acquiring small companies, and what could become competitors? And I'm going to join that with another question, which is, any thoughts on how the difference in the US being a Republican, not a or a republic, sorry, not a democracy, modifies your perspectives on policy? So basically, how should we interpret the differences between the parties, or how should we look at the system and understand why we are where we are?
So one of the things that we do in the book is we frame what we call the long-running race between disruption and democracy. And the moment that we're in, there's a kind of deeply ahistorical aspect to Silicon Valley always. So let's look back 150 years, right, to think about the way in which technological innovations over time transform our economy and our society. So go back to the telegraph, or think about the origins of the interstate telecommunications infrastructure in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s. And when you look at this in this historical perspective, you understand that in a system that combines our kind of free market orientation with democratic institutions that provide oversight and constraint, you get extraordinary innovation birthed in the private sector, often with government support and investment, to be clear. And then you get all of these benefits, that appear in society. And then you begin to get some awareness of the harms. And often those harms have to do with market power, but sometimes they have to do with other kinds of externalities that unfold. So the dominance, for example, of Western Union in the telegraph system, given the need to basically lay down expensive infrastructure, basically produces something that enables us to communicate across states, but a single company that's in control. Same thing plays out with the railroads, and then the ability to use that infrastructure to maintain that control. And how do they maintain that control? Well, they exercise power and influence over our political system. And so you have democracy struggling to keep up with disruption, and then you'll get these policy moments or windows when in one fell swoop, government tries to solve all the problems of market concentration or the harmful effects of technology. The problem is that then you're fixed into some new regulatory framework that can't adjust to changes that are 5 or 7 years down the line in the future. And so where are we now with respect to big tech? Why are Republicans and Democrats not taking action on big tech? Well, we're just at the beginning of an opening of a policy window, because we've had a bipartisan consensus that began with Democrats in the Clinton and Gore administration, and then followed through successive Republican administrations, and then into the Obama administration, that basically big tech was harmless, right? In fact, it was better than harmless. It was amazing. It was changing everything in ways that benefited everyone. And so people wanted to do a bear hug of the technology companies. You wanted to have Google on one side and Apple on the other side, and to think about the liberatory potential of technology, the economic growth potential of technology, and who looked askance at the regulatory momentum that was building in Europe when you were in office and thought, well, they're only doing that because they don't have any tech companies of their own, right? So they're trying to constrain this engine of American innovation and power. We're at a new moment now. You can find people on the Democratic side and the Republican side who want to put a big bullseye on big tech. There is equal vehemence on both sides of the aisle, although they diagnose the problem in slightly different ways. And so we find ourselves in a policy window where you'll actually see bipartisan momentum to tackle the problems of big tech. The question is, where can we come to agreement on the problem to be solved and how we should solve it? And that's what we spoke to earlier in terms of what are those low-hanging fruit. That doesn't mean that the Democrats aren't going to continue to bang the drums on antitrust and that Republicans aren't going to continue to raise concerns about censorship on the platforms. You will continue to have a partisan element. But the challenge in the current moment is to take advantage of the policy window that we're in to address the harms that are visible today, but also to think about how do we put ourselves in a position as a society where we don't only have moments of regulation that happen every 30 years when all the harms are evident, but how do we actually re-engineer our democratic systems to be much more flexible and adaptable? And I think the one comment I'd add, Maricha, on this question of like, we're a republic, we're not a direct democracy, what are the implications? The implications are this: the power that is invested in the hands of citizens in a democracy is to throw out your elected officials if you don't like what they're doing. And part of the story of the book is that if you are unhappy with the effects of technology on society, yes, you can be angry at the leadership of Google or Amazon or Apple or Microsoft and Facebook, but not only at them, because ultimately the failure to mitigate the harms of technology is a failure of our political system and our elected officials. And so there's a need for all of us in the context of a republic to get informed, to develop a view on these issues, and to hold politicians accountable for showing leadership in mitigating these harms.
Thank you. Great inspirational thoughts that everybody can and should really take their responsibility. This one is back to Rob. There's quite a few parallels being drawn with past lessons learned. So I'm going to join up a couple of questions. Here we go. For over 30 years, governments have failed to take appropriate action on climate change. And now with our, quote, back against the wall, end of quote, action is still insufficient. Given that, why do you think governments will be able to take appropriate action on AI and big tech? And then the other question, which I think is related, is that there are parallels between big tech today and the financial markets in 2007. The prevailing thought then was that regulation would stifle innovation in financial services, but the result was credit default swaps, mortgage-backed securities, and eventually market collapse. Is an equivalent collapse coming for big tech? And if so, what form might it take? In other words, climate regulations or the lack of action in light of big challenges, lessons learned from the banking crisis, why will now be different?
Yeah, these are really important questions and hardly unfamiliar concerns for any of us watching what's playing out on a global scale with climate, big tech, and the great variety of other things. So two quick responses on my part. Number one is we have been living in the United States, but more broadly in many democratic societies, through an era of great skepticism about the capacity of the state itself to carry out big projects. We used to go to the moon, and now we let the billionaires build the private space exploration. We wanted a great infrastructure plan, but the last meaningful thing we did in the United States was the highway system or something in that neighborhood. I think that we're possibly at the early moments of exiting from a 30-year period of just skepticism that the state is capable of grand projects. And part of that grand project in the United States especially will be to rise to the challenge of tackling some of the most obvious and thorny problems that we're all aware of, climate change and the concentrated power of the big tech firms. That's perhaps a bit more of a hope than an empirically based prediction, but I'd say that we don't really have many other options to hang on to. Like this is where we as ordinary people can invest our time and invest our aspirations. Second and final observation here is just to say, it is a design feature, not a design flaw of democracy, that it tends to be short term. We look to the next election in a small number of years to do, as Jeremy said, either re-elect the people for what they've done or to throw the bums out and to put someone else in. And democracies, as a consequence, don't have the easiest incentive structure in place for our elected officials to think about a longer time horizon. And climate in particular is one of those things where it's easy to imagine paying short-term costs that a politician will have to pay the consequences for at the next election in 2 years, where the gains might not be seen for 10, 20, or 30 years. And so part of the task of democratic institutions now is to try to come to terms with a longer time horizon orientation for thinking about planning, for thinking about infrastructure. And some of the things that we talk about in the book are efforts to point to very particular proposals that give democratic institutions the capacity to think long rather than always be reactive. And that's where I think we need creative and innovative minds at work to install that type of operating system within democracy so that it can handle these long-term challenges.
Thank you. I coincidentally was a co-referent to a speech of Mariana Mazzucato yesterday around her book, Mission Economy, and it almost sounds like you've read it and you're inspired by it. And if not, I would recommend you read it, because she is trying to do exactly that, to sort of see big societal challenges as a mission with a longer horizon, but a mission that excites bureaucracies and leaders and people on different sides of different political aisles to sort of come together and become more innovative to solve a problem, instead of, you know, doing more mundane parts of policy making. Anyway, it's indeed that type of thought that could reinvigorate democracies towards greater achievements and innovative capacity. I'm gonna pick up on another audience question, and this one is for Meron. I'm stuck while listening to this discussion that the issues are still largely framed. It's still in terms of societal responsibility and consequences or side effects. In other words, be wary of and avoid possible societal collateral damage while building out technology and technology-based services. But that's different than building for the purpose of achieving societal benefit in the first place. Can we envision a society where that's possible?
It's a great question. And you know, I think the building technology for a great society is possible. It's aspirational, right? And so what I would say is, right now we have a lot of technology for which we have identified harms that exist. And so the first thing we can do, or that we need to do, because that's more pressing, is to actually find ways to mitigate some of those harms. And as Jeremy alluded to, there is lots of low-hanging fruit in that area. And if we can get that done, what that shows is the ability of democracy to rise to the challenge. I think that's the, you know, I feel the same way a lot of the times when I'm watching the news. There's just so much skepticism of what can actually be done. And part of it is, if we can understand that there actually are things we can do now, that builds the optimism to do more later. In the long term, though, I do think there is a notion of how do we build technology for good? And you see signs of that on college campuses right now. We have an organization that's very healthy and vibrant at Stanford called CS plus Social Good. And one of the things they do is that students who look for ways in which technology can be used for societal benefit, right? And they do things like partner with NGOs to think about what kind of technology they need, help build prototypes for them to show them what might be possible, and then in some cases work to follow through to see what can actually be deployed. So I think that's a great area, but I don't think we should just look for that as a way to solve our current problems. I think there's pressing problems now that we have to address. And at the same time, in our educational systems and other structures that we have, there's also lots of ways that, you know, technology companies have gotten involved with this, things like programs like TEALS, where, you know, people from big tech companies are helping to teach the next generation about computer science. What we need to infuse in there is more examples of the ways you can build for good. And that's just part of the evolution of our educational process.
Thank you so much. Questions keep coming in. This one is for Jeremy. With politics come lobbyists. Will our democracy be able to flex the complexity?
So I pointed to this challenge earlier, and so maybe I'll say a few more words about it now. Politicians are generalists. You know, they need to cover a broad array of issues, and while they might have some expert staff that work for them, our staffing in government is thin. And it's even thinner if you think about state institutions or local institutions in comparison to the federal government. So we ask our politicians, you know, those who represent our interests and are meant to do the hard work of refereeing the different things that we might value and finding a way forward in our society to do the impossible, which is to educate themselves enough to understand what you care about, to understand, what the effects of a particular policy or regulatory change might be, and to take a position while forging consensus or compromise with others with a really limited staff at their disposal. And so organized corporate interests have used this structure of representative democracy to make sure that their voices are heard. And they do an extraordinary job of that. And we call that lobbying, right? It's the payment of expert staff who show up on Capitol Hill or show up in the executive branch and offer frameworks for legislation and provide facts and information to help legislators make this judgment. The question is, who's lobbying for the public interest, right? Where are our collective interests being accounted for in this system? And when you think about complex domains that involve and require technical knowledge and expertise, for example, issues of bias in algorithms, or thinking about the structure of platforms, the business model of platforms, and whether we can have successful platforms without requiring the monetization of personal data, or what's even possible with respect to content moderation in a world where you can't rely on human judgment, but you need AI to undertake that task. Who is providing a different set of views to the politician to counter or challenge the view that's offered up by the lobbyists paid by the tech companies? And that's where our system is failing. And I want to be clear that the failure of our system is a failure by choice. It's not that our system couldn't have that expertise. It's that expertise, just one example, an institution on the congressional side called the Office of Technology Assessment, was literally shut down during Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution, the contract with America. Newt Gingrich said, no, we don't need technical expertise in Congress. People can just get technical expertise in the market. So we've made systematic decisions in the federal government over time to erode our technical expertise and knowledge. And what that means is we put our politicians in a position of primarily receiving input and advice from those who are paid to represent the interests of companies. And so while lots of us are focused on the future of privacy legislation or AI regulation or upskilling in the future of work, I don't want people to lose sight of the fundamental task that we have, which is building a democratic system that is capable of governing technology before it governs us. And that means thinking about the future of the federal civil service. It means thinking about what expertise we recruit for when we elect politicians. It means thinking about the creation and support of independent institutions that represent a public interest rather than a private or commercial interest. And in our complex system, which, as we've said before, is the best technology that we've come up with to deal peaceably in a way that tries to forge consensus or agreement among diverse and conflicting views, we need all of those elements working, and we've underinvested in them up to this point.
Great, thank you. Building on this, it's a more philosophical approach to a somewhat similar question for Rob. Your central thesis is that a small elite power group, tech company directors, are making these decisions for us. But isn't the decision actually being made by the collective, by their free choice to adopt these things? By which I think they mean technologies and services. So,
sure, yeah. Let's be particular about this. Facebook is a global platform of more than 3 billion active users, and there's exactly one person who has de facto complete control over the information environment on Facebook. That's Mark Zuckerberg. Now, the question asks us to consider, well, all of us either choose to use or not use Facebook. So it doesn't also come down to the choice of the 3 billion of us who have signed on to the app or the platform and use the service. I see the attraction of the idea there, but I think it presents us with a false choice. First of all, our contention in the book is that 3 billion people and one person in control is too much power for one person or for one company. When you reach great scale, as these big tech companies have, the kinds of private governance that we started with just rise to the fore and call out for scrutiny and criticism. And then the idea that it all comes down to us as individual users is, we think, a mistake as well. Of course, we as individuals can decide to delete Facebook, as Jaron Lanier's famous and interesting book has suggested. But that goes back, for me, to the idea that Meron gave you at the start of the conversation, namely, if you, for some reason, you didn't like the cars that were available or the roadways to you, you felt like there was some modest dissatisfaction with the idea of getting in a car and going somewhere, you could decide just not to drive. And if you had other options, perhaps like public transportation or rideshare services, maybe there would be viable other options. But the idea that we should just basically tell people you can take the car on the roads as they are, or you can just not drive, is equivalent in our view to saying that to Facebook. And for what it's worth, Facebook would love it if it felt like all of the action in terms of doing something about the platform was just for every single person to decide what to do on his or her own with the app. What they really need is a collective and countervailing pressure from not individuals, but from democratic institutions and from civil society organizations. That's the path forward, not describing these massive system problems as the choices of consumers, whether to use or not to use.
Thank you. The last question goes to Meron. It was too early for the tech companies to predict the detrimental effects of personalization over relevance. How do we avoid such problems in the future before they scale?
Well, in hindsight, it's a lot more clear than in foresight, but part of the issue in trying to think forward is understanding that, what can potentially happen, right? What do you think would happen in a system where we just kind of let people loose and information starts to spread? And then how responsive are we to it? So, back in the 2016 election in the United States, where people were beginning to call out the fact that there was influence in the election, even before the election happened, right? Just during the electoral process up to the election. The response from many of the big platforms was, well, this really can't be that big of an effect, right? It's people's lived experience that's going to make the difference, right? So there was a skepticism that came with even having a negative impact. And I think part of the issue there is not that we would expect companies to be prescient, to be able to figure out every possible negative impact, but one, to be weary to think about what the impacts are. Two, to actually be trying to do some evaluations themselves of what they're actually seeing in that system. Like if you look at a lot of studies that are done on some of the larger platforms around, for example, whether or not there's bias in the ads they show, or whether or not there's some sort of political bias in the kinds of information, many of those are done by academics or by journalists. Why aren't they being done by the companies themselves, right? They actually have better access to this data. And so you can imagine either they can start to do that themselves to understand what's going on, or we can have a forcing function that says, these are the things you actually need to monitor to be able to understand what's going on. And so if those are the kinds of things that are in place, right, the lessons that are learned from some of the large tech platforms now that can be put in place that also make sense for the new entrants into the space. That's what we're talking about, is being able to learn from the experiences of the past to inform what we do in the future. And so this notion of the free for all, or you can just choose what apps you want to use, as Rob was just talking about, completely undermines the notion that there are lessons we have learned and we should put those lessons into practice through our democratic institutions. I think that's the place we get to, is let's learn from the past, not ignore it and just have the same problems over and over. There will be places where companies don't get it right. But in order to be responsive early on and to take a view of being self-critical as opposed to self-aggrandizing in terms of what's actually being accomplished, right? It's not always just changing the world for the better. It's not just always solving other people's problems. It's actually being cognizant of the fact that you're creating problems as well and owning up to it.
Thank you. I think it's a really great end and a brief summary in some ways of what your book is about, but there's so much more. I think this discussion was really rich. Thank you for answering all the questions, for jumping back and forth. Before we close, and we're almost at the end, The Computer History Museum has an initiative, and they call it the One Word Initiative. So the idea is that you each wrote down a word, or will quickly write down one word of advice. And it would be the type of advice in a word that you would give to a young person who is starting out in their career. And then once you share this one word, please share a little bit briefly about, why it is such a telling advice that you want to share. And then we will conclude with that. Rob, I'll start with you.
I'm going to play completely to stereotype here. My word is Socratic. The unexamined life is not worth living. And of course, the lesser known parallel, the unlived life is not worth examining. So don't be an ethical sleepwalker. Inquire within, examine within. And that's a pathway, I think, for an entirety of a life, not just at the beginning of it.
Wonderful. Jeremy.
So my word is go deep. It's 2 words. I was just going to do deep, but you need a verb, go deep. And for me, this is motivated by the idea that both when I was looking for my own career path, but also as a professor and as someone who served at the senior levels of government, I see generalists everywhere that I look. People who have invested in checking every box, trying out everything, who present themselves as capable of learning something quickly and rapidly being deployed. And I always hire the people who've gone deep. And I always wanted to be, as a young person, the person who had gone deep. And the reason is because if you really want to solve problems in the world, you have to get beyond the thin top layer of understanding. You have to go deep on the problem. You have to actually exercise your muscles in terms of thinking about how to solve a problem. You have to care as much about the idea as you do about implementation. And so my advice is always to young people to go deep, to pick something that you care about and look at it from every angle and work on it in a real setting and try and actually move the needle on the outcomes before you move on to your next thing, so that you bring into the world and every subsequent job that you have the experience of actually having seen something from start to finish.
Wonderful. Very powerful. Meron.
So the word I'd use is kindness. And so the reason why is, twofold. One is for someone who's young and starting out their career, I would tell them that a little bit of kindness goes a long way and will have a large impact in your life. It doesn't really cost you anything to be more kind, but the dividends that it will pay you for a long time and to other people are really tangible and they're meaningful. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was interesting because you saw a lot of kindness coming out in the world, people who were watching out for other people who were, cognizant of, trying to help others who maybe weren't in a situation as fortunate as they were. And I hope that's one thing we can take away from the pandemic, for all the problems that it causes, for all the, stress that it's created on relationships, is just to think about a little bit more kindness, both toward other people and to ourselves, because the world can always use more kindness and it doesn't cost you anything.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'll briefly give the floor or the screen back to Daniel, and then we will wrap. All the best with the launch of the book, and hope many people will be encouraged to read it after this session.
And I agree. What a wonderful program. Thank you all so much for your time and the energy and the thought that you put into the creation of this wonderful piece. It's really clear that the alignment with the Computer History Museum and our belief that life as we know it doesn't exist without computing, what you've done is looked at a very, very complicated set of issues. Any technology, anything that can be deployed at scale can be weaponized, and inevitably will be. And I think the road analogy was particularly interesting for me, as you think a little bit about history and its implications on the present and the direction that it can provide for the future. It turns out 100 years ago, more or less, the court system pierced the corporate veil in terms of liability from auto dealerships into the manufacturers for the liability of death through automobiles and automobile accidents. There are structural and code issues associated with life as we know it, regulatory, social codes, values that were discussed, but equally important, the software code and the algorithms that are driving things in the future. And I do believe that, many of the points that were made, in particular, the one relative to the problems we're trying to solve and the types of achievable outcomes, and in particular, the effect on the workforce and workforce development and the human condition. And that's about education. And so I encourage all of you to A, read the book, and B, share and do your best to help facilitate a process whereby people have a sense of where they are in a world of computing and that they actually can have agency to make a difference. So again, wonderful program. I appreciate all of the author's work and a wonderful moderated program. Thank you all for joining CHM. And I encourage you to, again, contribute to CHM, go to our website. If you love these programs, we could use your support. So thanks everyone, and best wishes, and be safe.